Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jay Michaels. I'm here again at Phoenix FearCon. That's phoenixfearcon.com, the longest running film festival for the genre, or possibly any film festival, running from October 16 through December 31. Now, we're talking about science fiction, fantasy, and horror movies. Let's throw some horror movie plots at you and tell me if these movies sound like they should be made. Let's say we get a valiant warrior who wants to be king. So he enlists the aid of supernatural demonic forces to kill the king and make him the ruler of the land. But all the ghosts of the people that he killed return. That sound good? Sound pretty bloody? Maybe some battle scenes in there? You like bloody, eh? Let's go one step further. How about two adversarial families? And one seeks his revenge on the other by taking the children of that other family, grinding them up into pies, and then handing those pies to their mother to eat. Oh, sounds pretty gory, doesn't it? Oh, you don't want gory. You want something more of a psychological thriller. I have an idea. Why don't we get a manic depressive, wealthy kid who keeps seeing ghosts telling him to murder his uncle and wreak revenge? Oh, that sounds pretty deep, doesn't it? Oh, you like something more comical? How about a group of otherworldly sprites entering a forest and screwing around with two sets of young lovers? Maybe that'll work. You want to know where those movies are? They're in Shakespeare. I've just told you about Macbeth. I've told you about Titus Andronicus, Hamlet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. Before there were horror TV shows, before there were horror movies, before there was the horror play, before there was the horror novel, there was Shakespeare and the supernatural forces. We are here with a Shakespeare authority and one of the leading commentators in New York about Shakespeare, the host of New York Shakespeare online, Rodney Hakim. Rodney has spent over 25 years studying, working, performing, and analyzing Shakespeare. And so I couldn't imagine anyone better to chat with about this. And since I've known him for most of that time, it's an absolute thrill to speak to him. Rodney, welcome. I'm glad you can make it.
Thank you, Jay. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. And I thank you for the talk up. I'm excited to see those plays and to do them again. You make it sound so exciting, and it is.
Tell me, when we talk about Shakespeare, we think stuffy, we think boring, we think inaccessible. That seems to be the stereotype. Even to this day, I have students who says, do we have to read Shakespeare? It's still there. But there's so many frightening elements in Shakespeare. What was the climate of that time period that Shakespeare felt the need to put in ghosts and demons and even the devil himself at one point?
Well, you really kind of hit it on the head, Jay, in terms of people still having the perception that Shakespeare is somehow removed from them, or too difficult, or the language is incomprehensible, or it's not that they can't crack, and it's anything but the truth. You know, in reality, Shakespeare, of course, we consider him the greatest playwright in Western history, and he is, but it doesn't mean that it's some lofty thing that you can't understand or you can't access. You just have to scratch the surface a little bit, and it's all right there. For anyone that has a knowledge of the audience that Shakespeare was playing for, Shakespeare was playing for the high and the low. He played for the wealthy, and he played for the poor. He played for the lords and the ladies who sat in the upper boxes, or in some cases even sat on the stage and had priority seating, VIP seating, I should say. And then he played for the groundlings. Who were the groundlings? The groundlings were the common folk, the poor folk, the working class, as you might say, who paid just a tiny amount just to get in, and they didn't have a seat, they just stood. They stood in a pit, literally a pit in the front of the stage, and they had their beer and they had their whatever, they had their ale, and they had a rowdy, raucous time while they watched what was transpiring on stage. And Shakespeare, perhaps more than any other playwright in history, knew how to play to his audience. He knew what to write to engage his audience and keep them entertained. Why? Because there were so many competing sources of entertainment in Elizabethan England. Much like today, where you can barely get someone to be compelled to go down to a theater. Not that the theaters are open in New York in the coronavirus era, but when they were, you could barely compel someone to go and pay $50 to go see a show off Broadway, or perhaps $200 to see a show on Broadway. Why would they want to do that? Because they can sit in the comfort of their home and see whatever they want on Amazon Prime or on Netflix or on whatever. In Shakespeare's day, that was not a dissimilar situation. In Shakespeare's day, there were a ton of options for the viewing public, and those included things that were very visceral and very exciting, like bear baiting and dogfight. One of the big competitions for Shakespeare's viewing audience, and for the rabble, that we might say, the groundlings, that were the people that composed a big chunk, perhaps the biggest chunk of its audience, was that they could just go across town in London, and they can go to a big theater, an amphitheater, where they could sit in almost like what you would consider today professional wrestling or UFC fighting or something like that. They could see combat. They could see people thrown in pits and being forced to defend themselves against live, hungry bears. And that's pretty exciting. That's pretty hard to compete with when you're a playwright writing in iambic pentameter. So Shakespeare had to make his plays just as juicy and just as gory and just as exciting and just as compelling for that audience. And if they weren't watching bear baiting, they were watching dog fights. If they weren't watching dog fights, they were watching all sorts of other entertainment that were popular at that time. So Shakespeare really had to push the envelope with what he could offer on stage. And he was one of the first to offer the ghosts that appear on stage. We have the ghosts that Jay referred to at the top of the program in Hamlet. We had Hamlet's father appearing as a ghost. We have the three witches, the three sisters, the weird sisters of Macbeth. We have all the gore and blood of Titus Andronicus, and we have the fairy sprites. We have all the whimsical fairies that appear in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And these all tap into different perceptions of what the Elizabethan age would consider the afterlife, or the ghosts of the afterlife. And we can delve into that in more detail, Jay, as we go forward.
Sure. It's interesting you say about the afterlife. The thing that I'm looking at in terms of the horror of Shakespeare, if you will, he did this, okay, the audience wanted it. Now, he had two things: sex sells. He had so many moments in Romeo and Juliet that were downright profane, and not even from Romeo and Juliet. The character of the nurse in Romeo and Juliet, the language she uses today, I don't want to know what it would sound like translated into modern English.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there are whole books that are dedicated to Shakespeare's body, to Shakespeare's foul language. And Shakespeare was not by any means above foul language. Now, here's a funny thing. In Shakespeare's day, we're thinking of indecent scenes, shall we say. But in Shakespeare's day, there were no women that were allowed on stage. There were no female performers. The female roles were played by young boys in drag, essentially, young boys in female costumes. So it added a layer of intrigue, shall we say, a layer of questioning perhaps one's own gender identity, to use contemporary parlance, to see a romantic scene between Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo was a young man, perhaps in his 20s or 30s, and Juliet was played by a young boy, perhaps 9 or 10 or 13 or thereabouts, dressed as a woman. So that the fact that people were putting those young boys in those situations, and it was publicly accepted. It wasn't as if it was you're tearing something out of Nambla's playbook to put something like that on stage. It was just that was what was culturally acceptable, but it was still racy. So Shakespeare putting that on stage. Go ahead.
The interesting thing about that's very progressive when you think about it. You're right about gender bending, about gender identity was very progressive. His use of monsters, ironically, looks like it went in the other direction. I think he tapped into, there's the Macbeth curse that talks about it, and so many other places that he taps into the ghosts, the demons, the graves, the dead, and this was something much deeper in them. They were a very religious society. Hell and heaven and everything in between was tantamount to them at that point, wasn't it?
Very much so, and very much. And I am an avid listener of a podcast that's put out by one of the leading Shakespeare institutions in the United States, the Folger Shakespeare, and that's called Shakespeare Unlimited. And on a really great episode of that you can go back and find in their catalogs, of Shakespeare Unlimited, there is an episode where they talk just about this, about the ghosts of Shakespeare. And there's a wonderful scholar that I'd have to look up his name, but he makes some wonderful points about the different kinds of ghosts that were in people's minds in the era of Shakespeare. And in Shakespeare's era, it was the era, for those that might not know, it was the era of Queen Elizabeth. And shortly after her passing, it transferred over to King James I, who unified England and Scotland. So in that era, England and Scotland were Protestant. The Protestants had taken over and outlawed Catholicism. So this was a big cultural change from what was previously the dominant religion, Christianity, to Catholicism, that form of Christianity, and then replaced with Protestantism. And it wasn't just replaced in the way that, okay, everyone, here's a notice, we're Protestant. Sorry, you can keep on being Catholic at home. That's fine. Just don't wear it out loud. Don't wear it on your shirt. It wasn't the case. Being Catholic was now punishable by death. So you had to renounce your Catholicism publicly or be tortured and hanged and whatever else. And this was a tension. This was a source of great tension in the zeitgeist of the community at that time, because there was still Catholicism, there was still paganism, there was still a lot of primitive forms of religion that were being practiced. And it wasn't just that it was one uniform society of people in England at that time. It wasn't just one heterogeneous culture. England at that time was very cosmopolitan. It was a melting pot, kind of like contemporary New York is one of the, what you would say today, where New York City is the crossroads of the world. At that time, England, London specifically, was the crossroads of the world. And that's where many cultures came together. Many people of different parts of the world came together, and they brought different religions and different cultures with them. So that came with different cultural understandings of what the afterlife is. So to come back to the main point, what was the perception of ghosts in this society, in this multicultural society where the new blanket rule was Protestantism? So the dominant belief was that once you died, your soul either went to heaven or it went to hell. But there was an additional realm. There was a purgatorial realm. And if you died, and we see this very clearly in Hamlet, if you die and you don't renounce all your sins, you don't confess and renounce all your sins before your death, then your ghost, your soul, stays in purgatory until God, or whatever the force beyond is, decides what to do with you. So we see in Hamlet, Hamlet's father is killed, and he does not have the chance to renounce his sins before his killing, his murder. So Hamlet's ghost is lingering around, and Hamlet has to figure out, is this a purgatorial ghost? Is this a ghost that's lingering and stuck in purgatory and needs my assistance to clear him of his sins, to clear the people that killed him so he can ascend to heaven? Or is he not? Or is he some other kind of ghost? Is he a malevolent ghost like the witches from Macbeth? Similarly, in Hamlet, Claudius, the king, the brother that killed Hamlet's father, Hamlet's uncle, he is at a moment when Hamlet finally, after his vacillation and indecision, decides that he's finally going to take vengeance for his murdered father and kill Uncle Claudius. He finds Uncle Claudius is in a church and he is in the middle of repentance. So he says, I can't kill him. I can't kill Claudius at this moment. Why? Because he's in the middle of cleansing his soul, and to kill him in this moment would damn my soul to hell, my soul to purgatory, to the uncertain fate of what comes beyond. So we have a lot of competing forces and competing understandings of what lies beyond. Go ahead, Jay.
It's so interesting. You saw me take a breath. It's so interesting because when you talk about that, two things came into my head. Number one, Hamlet has some line, if I kill him now, thus his soul ascends to heaven.
Right.
And again, you go back to the horror movie rules for this, and only those who die deserve to die. In horror movies, the joke is the promiscuous girl is killed, the arrogant guy, they're always killed while they're drunk, and the unbeliever, if you will. So we almost see the foundation of the horror movie rule by him saying, I can't kill him because then I will go to hell, and I can't kill him because thus his soul goes to heaven. So we're starting to see that. You also, it's so fun. In Julius Caesar, Caesar, who's alive in Act 1, or the beginning, when I did it, it was 2 acts. In the second half, his ghost returns to threaten Brutus. And I was just about to say, well, why did his ghost? And I thought, of course, he too did not have a chance to confess his sins. So they kept that logic, and the ghost still returned. Now you mentioned one of my favorites. You mentioned Macbeth. Macbeth, there is a curse. Macbeth also insinuates not, and I won't say malevolence, I'll say the spiritual realm, but he insinuates paganism a great deal, because you have 3 witches, and in the pagan spirituality, there is the mother, the maid, and the crone. So you have 3 types of female. You see it in a couple of movie versions. Ironically, you see it in Hugh Hefner's movie version because of the age of the witches. But you see that inference, and you hear about a curse. And the way I've heard it, I don't know if you know, I'm sure you know about the curse. But do you know how it formed? Do you know where the curse came from? There's like 82 different reasons. Do you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of different thought about that, about where the curse comes from. And I think if you look at what's happening in society at the time that this play is being written and who it's being written for, that kind of informs some of those readings of it. At the time that Macbeth was being written, that's late 15, maybe about 1601 to 1603, depending who you ask and what the chronology is. That is right around the time that Queen Elizabeth of England, Queen Elizabeth I, is dying. And King James I of Scotland, her next blood relative, is about to unify for the first time in who knows how many centuries, England and Scotland. So it only makes sense that Scotland is the location of the play, because Scotland is who it's being performed for. Essentially, Macbeth is being performed in a way as a welcome, as a bridge between Elizabethan England and the New England under the rule of James I of Scotland. So to put the hero, even if he's an anti-hero of sorts, conflicted hero, in the role of the Scottish king, is a very bold thing, because that could run the risk of putting Shakespeare in the wrong perception from King James I, but also it could make King James I look like a anti-hero himself. It could make King James I look like a conquering hero, because Macbeth, despite his tragic flaws, he is able to conquer the land. He doesn't allow himself to be limited by being a thane. He doesn't only limit himself to being the thane of Cawdor or the thane of Fife. He wants to be the king, even if he has to take some perhaps risky steps to make that change. Perhaps King James I had that same apprehension about himself. Maybe he felt that it was too big of a burden or too big of an affront to the people of England to take over England and become their new king after they had deified Queen Elizabeth for so many decades. People loved Queen Elizabeth so much that her visage, her appearance became the standard of beauty. She's renowned for having a very pale skin tone and having red hair and having a very high hairline. And so that became the standard of beauty, where people in Elizabethan England, it's the period is even named after Elizabethan England, would modify their appearance. They would dust themselves with white chalk or whatever other pigment it was, make themselves look more pale, and they would put their hair in her format. So to take that populace who have loved Queen Elizabeth so much and deified her, made her the Virgin Queen, made her out to be almost a goddess, and to put that aside and to allow King James I to come in and establish himself in a way is a direct parallel to what Macbeth has to do to get rid of the beloved King Duncan and allow his reign to begin.
How do you think that made the curse? Do you think that had anything to contribute to the curse that people talk about with Macbeth?
Well, the curse is for those who might be not following along. The curse of Macbeth is that he will achieve the status of king, but that he will not have any heirs, that his rival, Banquo, will be the father to a long line of heirs. So this was a big issue in Elizabethan England, is that Elizabeth was never able to have an heir herself. She was never able to produce a son who would rightfully take over the throne and carry on her legacy. So King James I of Scotland, a fairly distant blood relative, takes over. And it's a big question, not just for him, but for Elizabethan society, if he is going to establish a long line of heirs that will not only carry on his legacy, but will forever cement England and Scotland together into one unified land. And I'm sure for many residents of England, that was not necessarily something they wanted. They could have seen Scotland as a rival territory, and they were rivals for many instances over the previous centuries. So I think the fact that King James I from Scotland is coming in and taking over is a source of great trepidation, of great anxiety for Shakespeare and his audience. And Shakespeare is tapping into that. Shakespeare had a tremendous ability to tap into the fears and the anxieties and the zeitgeist of what was going on in his time and to put that on stage. And I think you see that with some of our best writers today and some of our best filmmakers today. We're talking about fear, we're talking about horror films, terror. And what are some of the best horror films? You have Alien, you have Psycho, you have some of those classics that tap into our contemporary fears and our contemporary anxieties. So Shakespeare, I think, was doing just the same.
You know what? That's are you? It sounds to me like you're saying that the fear that the audience had in accepting the Scottish king, thus this Scottish play, actually created. It still exists today. People don't say Macbeth in the theater for that reason. Right. It still exists today.
Right.
I had heard it even went one step further, that Shakespeare had written down actual incantations, for lack of better terms. So the double, double, toil and trouble that we know has something in it that might actually be a curse. And actual pagan witches discovered that he stole from them. And so they put a curse on the play, that whenever you utter the name of the play, someone is going to die, something terrible is going to happen. It's interesting, if it's not witches, then maybe, yes, someone said, okay, well, this Scottish king is taking our land. Okay, we are cursing him and cursing this play that, because rumor is that King James said he was actually related to Banquo, which is how he ended up becoming a ruler.
All interesting stuff. And sure, I've heard those rumblings about, Shakespeare having, he had some kind of illicit dealings, and there's all kind of theories about how, Shakespeare had interactions with Christopher Marlowe, who was known to dabble in occult practices, and how perhaps something that Marlowe had done might have impugned Shakespeare or informed him with some kind of paganistic rituals that he was involved with. I don't know if you ever saw it on TNT channel on TV. There was a series they did a couple of years back called Will, where they explored just that. They explored the idea that Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, being contemporaries, were dabbling in these practices. Specifically, Christopher Marlowe, in his search. Christopher Marlowe, for those that might not know, is a very famous playwright, a contemporary of Shakespeare's, and his most famous play is Dr. Faustus. And what happens in Dr. Faustus, to borrow the phrasing that they use in this show on TNT Will, is that he literally brings the devil on stage. He brings Mephistopheles, he brings the devil on stage, and according to this TV series, now whether this is really historically accurate or not, who knows, like some of the other reports are talking about the witches. But there's any range of possibilities, because we don't really have much concrete evidence from some of those encounters. A lot of this is hearsay, and we have a scrap here and a scrap there that informs us, and we kind of extrapolate from that. But according to the idea of this TV series, is that Marlowe was so deeply involved in the idea of attaining some kind of elucidation from these occult practices, from what we would consider today almost acid trip or something of that type, that he would encounter witches and devils and other kind of dregs of society. This is also to connect with what's happening in the contemporary United States right now, right now we are in many places, we're just coming out of a lockdown because of the coronavirus pandemic. And this is something that was happening in Elizabethan society as well. They were experiencing the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague
Right.
caused the shutdown of society. It caused the shutdown of theaters. It caused people to be segregated and locked into their homes, not able to come to the theater. It caused Shakespeare no end of difficulty because the theaters were shut down and he couldn't produce his work. He couldn't get paid. His actors couldn't be on the stage. So Shakespeare turned to other things. He turned to sonnets. He turned to all kind of other things to keep himself occupied. To the long poems, Venus and Adonis, Rape of Lucrece, all kind of other things. So the idea that some of the fears that are associated with the plague, where half of European population died, and the other half that survived were constantly in fear that they could be infected, that they could stumble onto someone that unknowingly has the plague and they could become sick. It caused a perception in society, almost a literal witch hunt. Literally, there were witch hunts in this era because people that were dabbling in perhaps occult arts or maybe methods of healing themselves, of healing the plague that were not scientifically acceptable, not that there was much science at that time, but that were not acceptable in a mainstream sense, could be deemed witchcraft. So the idea that, yeah, I've heard the idea that Shakespeare ingested with witches, but I take that with a grain of salt because in that day, pretty much anyone that didn't stick to the party line, so to speak, could be accused of witchcraft. So it's not such a clear-cut thing.
It's interesting you're talking about how fears can manifest and witch hunts and things of that nature. Wasn't it true? Well, it's all hearsay. Edward Allen, who played, and you bring up one of my favorite non-Shakespeares of the era, Dr. Faustus. Firstly, Christopher Marlowe has his own conspiracy because there is a section of his play that was removed before it was performed back then because he insulted the church. There is a whole passage of Mephistopheles toward the end where he basically says the church is a bunch of BS and don't believe anything they say. This was removed from it, and then mysteriously, within a year, Christopher Marlowe was accidentally killed in a bar.
Right.
So there's things to that. Edward Allen, who played Dr. Faustus on stage, supposedly stopped doing theater right after that because he swears he conjured up a genuine demon during one of the incantation sequences within it. So the notion of seeing a ghost on stage. Now he was so into his role that maybe there was a hallucination, maybe he wasn't feeling well, maybe he was exhausted, and so he thought he saw a ghost, and it forced him to go into a life of goodness. He eventually joined the church. He became something within the church. Do you think audiences at the sight of a ghost would be in absolute terror simply because it's a ghost? It points out hell. It points out. Did Shakespeare say to himself as he's writing it, I know what will terrify my audience. I'm going to have 3 witches, then a ghost, then Hecate, then I'm going to do this, and that is going to terrify them. You think he played on them? He played on their fears?
Absolutely. That was money in the bank. I don't know what to compare it to in a contemporary sense. Right now in our contemporary society, there are so many fears and anxieties. You see it on the news all the time, or in the paper that so-and-so person thought they saw a ghost and they shot their so-and-so, or there's fears and anxieties about UFOs and aliens, and you'll see constantly that there's always some scuttlebutt about how the government has some secret knowledge about Area 51 and there's really UFOs, and you can go into any number of those things that tap into what we as people don't know and don't understand and want to know and want to understand, but we don't have the physical proof. So we're always looking for it. And if someone puts something that is a semblance of it in front of us, we are scared, but we are excited also. There's a frisson. There's almost an enjoyable fear of wanting to discover that. And that's what ghosts were like in the Elizabethan era. Ghosts were that almost a taboo realm, the life after death, what happens, as Hamlet says, when we shuffle off this mortal coil, that it was the great unknown. And there's one of Hamlet's most famous speeches, the to be or not to speech, is all about that. It's
Right.
the most famous speech you could say, even in the history of English drama, is about what happens to us when we die. To be or not to be is an exploration of the fear, the anxiety that Hamlet is so afraid of what's going to happen to him after he dies, because it's so uncertain and so unclear, that he would rather not act and not fulfill his whole journey in the play than to take that chance and go into this unknown realm. So that unknown realm was taboo, it was scary, it was thrilling, and Shakespeare had a stage set up in a way. We talked about the groundlings being in the pit at the top of the program, and what they were maybe at chest level or chin level for them was the top of the stage, and that's where the actors are standing on. In that area beneath where the actors are standing, that was from chest down for the standing audience in the pit, was what it was an underground hidden area, and that's what Shakespeare referred to as hell. There was a trap door in the middle of the stage, and hell was where the ghosts, Hamlet's ghosts, the witches, Hecate, all of those apparitions would come from. And it was kind of like you'd see a magician pull something out of a hat, or someone appears in a magic show. So it's thrilling, it's scary. It still has the same impact on us now, but we've been indoctrinated to it over the years because we've seen so much of it. The audience of Shakespeare's day, this was a very novel thing for them. They hadn't seen this before. So to create a situation where they're seeing an optical illusion, where suddenly a ghostly figure will appear out of nowhere, literally out of hell, and come to the front and emerge from the depths and come out and have this, whatever effects they use. They had all kind of effects that they used in that day, with the fire and brimstone and all kind of things. And to have that appear was the equivalent of whatever you could conjure in today's horror films, whatever jump scare and whatever the effect is.
It's a CGI of today.
It's a CGI. You see it all the time in horror films where you'll be watching a character and all of a sudden they'll turn around and there's a dastardly figure behind them, a ghost, a killer, or whatever. The antagonist that's been trailing them the whole film, Jason, Freddy, whoever, all of a sudden they'll appear. And that sudden, that appearance of this ghostly figure, this demonic figure, has such terror to it. So to have that occur in a situation where in a theatrical presentation it wasn't there before was thrilling. It was exciting. It was what people paid money to come see.
I'm glad you said that. Last question, because I know you have to disappear very soon.
Right. I have to go off into the ether.
Yeah, you bring up a very interesting point. Did they want to know the truth? It was very recently I had a conversation with David Howard Thornton, who plays Art the Clown in Terrifier, and he was telling me about a sequence in that. No spoilers for those who haven't seen it, but those who have know what I'm talking about when I say the hacksaw sequence. And he was saying when they were trying to sell the movie, many places were saying, cut that scene and we'll distribute your movie. And the director said, no, the audience wants this. Very recently, there was in the news a videotape of someone who, with their camera phone, videoed what turned out to be a blimp over a stadium, but from where it was, it looked like a UFO.
Right.
And everybody jumped on the fact it was a UFO, enough so that Facebook started cutting out entries because it was erroneous. I don't know how many horror films people say, how was the movie? His head got cut off. No, but how was the movie? Well, the knife went through. Do we really want to know the truth, or do we just adore, just like they did back then? Is it the same? And I hate to put it this way, it almost makes me sound political. Do we want to stay ignorant? Do we want to say, there's a monster, there's a ghost, there's a ghoul, they're coming to get me? Or do we want that? Is there something in us that says, bring on hell? We want hell even though we know there is none?
The answer is yes and no. It's both. As I mentioned early on, Shakespeare's audience was very mixed. He played to the highbrow audience and to the lowbrow audience. So there is that invitation there for all of them. For the highbrow audience that was there, the lords and the dukes and the wealthy that would sit in the upper booths and have the VIP spots, and the queen and the king and whoever else. For them, it was perhaps an academic exploration or a highbrow way to see something played out on stage that they understood in a more formal way, but it was still thrilling to see. For the people in the pit, for the groundlings, this was exactly what you're talking about, with the hatchet scene and with the stabbing in Psycho and with all that. It's that thrilling, that murderous, that, you know, we all have that impulse to you can't not look at a train wreck. You can't not look at the guy when Joe Theismann broke his leg. You can't not stop and rewind and watch him break his leg over and over again to see exactly how it happened. You have to see that bloody, gory, violent thing because it's just part of our nature. So yes, the beauty and the way that it's done in the profound language that it's done is there for one segment of the audience, and the violence, the spasms of violence, the murders, the funny, the bawdy, all of that is there for the rest of the audience. And you can find whichever part of that most fits your sensibility, your personality in pretty much any of Shakespeare's plays, but especially the ones we talked about and the ones that weren't here with the addition of the ghost and the goblin.
You think the kings and queens were scared also? Or did they just go, oh, isn't it marvelous the way they did that?
Oh, you know what? I think kings and queens, they probably enjoyed it themselves on a personal level, but I think it was also a great barometer for them to be able to see what a cross-section of their populace was thinking and feeling. Oh. I think it was a great way to get a gauge of what is happening out there.
Wow, so by them enjoying, now the kings and queens could easily go to see, they could easily have the actors come to them. You see command performances in Midsummer Night's Dream and so many others where the players come to the king. In Hamlet, of course, you see that. That's one of the major sequences. Mm-hmm. But they would go and sit in those opera boxes up top, not so much to watch To Be or Not to Be, but see how the audience reacted to it.
It was both. It was both. It was for them to watch the play. They loved the plays. To watch the audience. They love to see what the audience reacted to, but also to be seen. Queen Elizabeth, one of her greatest strengths was her ability to control the population's thoughts and to make them think that she was part of them, even though she was so far removed from them. So the fact that Queen Elizabeth would come and sit in the audience with them, within 10 feet of the groundlings, of the poor, was a way for her to connect to them and to make them feel one with her. So it was as much for her enjoyment as it was for her making the audience enjoy her involvement.
Wow. I just learned something. There you go. That's great. That's great. I know you have to leave, so I'll give my sign off afterwards. I just want to say, Rodney, Hakim, thank you so much. It is always a pleasure to speak to you. You always elucidate me on so many things regarding Shakespeare. Arrogantly, I think I've learned so much. No, not until I speak to you. Then the level rises. Thank you so much. Rodney and I are doing a series called The Fourth Folio, where we discuss whether there is a Shakespeare or not. He believes that Shakespeare wrote all his plays. I believe it was done by anybody else. So I'll let you know all about those. Rodney, thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Phoenix FearCon viewers, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. Jay, I look forward to our next discussion. For sure. And for anyone who wants to check us out, we're New York Shakespeare on social media. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ciao. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions for Rodney Hakim, about Shakespeare, about the mysteries of Shakespeare, the ghosts, or anything like that, or just want to speak to him about anything you heard during this discussion, you can send an email to jmcommet@gmail.com. That's jmcomnet@gmail.com. And since the festival runs until December 31, I will have a chance to connect with Rodney and share your information. And as I said, the Fourth Folio featuring Rodney Hakim will go live probably in the next month. So look for information on social media about who wrote Shakespeare. This is Jay Michaels at FearCon, thrilled to chat with you all. And if these shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended. that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. Ciao.